They found her in the winter of 2021, buried beneath a collapsed timber outpost on the northern edge of the old Jin Dynasty frontier. And the archaeologists who reached her chamber described a stillness so suffocating that none of them spoke for several minutes. Because the bones were not scattered like the aftermath of a battlefield collapse, but arranged in a manner that suggested deliberate placement, her spine twisted at an unnatural angle, as if she had been forced to kneel long after her strength had failed. Her wrists were bound with strips of iron that had fused to the bone. And beside her lay the shredded remains of lacquered silk that once belonged only to imperial women of the highest rank. What unsettled the excavation team was not simply the violence hinted at by the fractures on her ribs, but the carved wooden tablet positioned beneath her jaw, etched with a command in old Mongolian script that implied she had been displayed as an example to others before dying slowly in captivity. A cruelty so calculated that even Genghis Khan's own generals reportedly turned their eyes away. This is what imperial chroniclers tried to hide. Until now, in the final decade of the Jin dynasty, when the northern fortresses trembled under the pressure of Mongol cavalry raids that arrived without warning and vanished. Just as quickly, a young woman named Princess Liang Huai, recorded in a surviving household scroll as being 17 at the time of her capture near Jiangdu in 1213, became one of the many royal hostages taken not for ransom or negotiation, but for the psychological warfare practiced by the Mongols. Command, who understood that the humiliation of a princess could fracture the morale of an entire court more effectively than the destruction of a single garrison. And it was during the chaotic retreat from the outer capital that Liang Huai separated from her attendants and dragged across the frozen plain toward the encampment of Subbutai's vanguard, entered a world in which royal blood offered no protection at all. The reason her name appears repeatedly in Jin memorial records is that she belonged to a lineage believed to carry symbolic authority. And her capture signaled not just a tactical loss, but a cosmic insult in the eyes of her people who viewed the fall of imperial women into enemy hands as an omen of dynastic collapse. A belief the Mongols exploited masterfully by parading such captives before terrified envoys to demonstrate that even the most sacred boundaries could be erased without consequence, which allowed them to fracture diplomatic negotiations before they even began. Because no court could claim stability when its daughters vanished into the steppe with no promise of return. What sealed her fate, however, was an older wartime doctrine preserved in Mongol oral tradition, a practice known among their commanders as Toro Yin Sorel, a term implying punitive re-education through controlled suffering inflicted on politically valuable captives. And while Chinese chroniclers softened the description by equating it with ritualized hostage treatment, later findings suggest that the process involved deprivation, forced displays, and psychological dismantling designed to crush the symbolic power of aristocratic women, which meant that Liang Huai, by virtue of her rank, would endure far harsher treatment than common captives whose deaths carried no political weight. The first clues to her actual experience surfaced in a fragmentary report discovered in the Luoyang archives in 1898, a document that references a northern girl of noble birth confined for the breaking of her lineage. And historians ignored it for decades until modern archaeology revealed its connection to her grave, transforming speculation into evidence. What happened next was documented by a court scribe taken during the same campaign, and it sat hidden for 800 years. When historians finally revisited the Luoyang fragment in the early 20th century, they realized the brief note about a girl of noble birth confined for the breaking of her lineage aligned disturbingly with the Mongol custom of public degradation, used not as punishment but as a psychological weapon against enemy dynasties. And it was during the translation of these passages that a far older document surfaced in the archives of the Yongning Monastery. A battered codex rescued from a ruined storage hall in 1903, containing a partial journal attributed to a captured Jin court scribe named An Qishuan, who reportedly survived several years inside a Mongol administrative camp before dying under unclear circumstances. And the journal's condition made it nearly impossible to read. Yet enough lines remained intact for scholars to identify direct descriptions of Princess Liang Huai's treatment. Descriptions were so vivid and unsparing that early translators refused to publish them in full, preferring to annotate the material indirectly while leaving the most disturbing sentences untranslated because they feared accusations of embellishment or political bias. Although later archaeological findings confirmed that Han Yishuan had been recording exactly what he witnessed with no exaggeration at all. The journal opens with a bleak passage describing the Mongol forward camp near the frozen banks of the Liao River and the stench of slaughtered horses mingled with the metallic scent of cold air. And Han explains that the prisoners were housed not in tents but in shallow pits dug into the earth and reinforced with wooden beams which trapped heat during winter but also trapped moisture and disease, turning the ground floors into muddy, suffocating hollows that clung to the skin and made breathing difficult, especially at night when a thin crust of ice formed over the pits, forcing captives to scratch at the frozen layer with numb fingers so they would not suffocate in their sleep. And it was within one of these pits that Han first saw Princess Liang Huai. Han writes with an emotional restraint that only intensifies the horror of what he describes. And one line in particular has been cited repeatedly by modern historians attempting to understand the psychological dimension of Mongol warfare. Because after detailing the conditions of Liangji's confinement, he adds, "They do not harm her for pleasure or anger, but for meaning, because they believe that to unravel a nation, one must unravel its daughters. And the undoing of her dignity becomes the undoing of the banners she once represented." The phrase "undoing of her dignity" has caused intense debate among translators. But archaeologists now believe Han meant the systematic stripping of symbolic authority rather than any personal violation, since several Mongol chronicles emphasize that royal captives were preserved alive, precisely because their humiliation had political purpose. And this interpretation aligns with surviving steppe traditions in which hostages were forced into ritualized acts designed to display submission. Acts that, though not sexual in nature, inflicted profound emotional and physical suffering on those subjected to them. The codex continues with descriptions of a structure within the Kirk-gur or Blue Pavilion, a place reserved for special prisoners whose presence served tactical or diplomatic functions. And Han offers chilling architectural details, explaining that the pavilion's interior walls were lined with polished bone panels used for divination ceremonies, while the floor consisted of packed snow mixed with ash from ritual fires, creating a surface that melted under bare feet and then refroze, causing numbness that spread upward through the legs until the captive lost the ability to stand without trembling. And Han writes that Liang Huai was taken to this pavilion at least once every 3 days to be displayed before. He recalls one encounter in particular where a Mongol commander identified as Boro Adai turned away in visible discomfort as she struggled to remain upright while guards forced her to recite her lineage under threat of further deprivation. And Han notes that the commander's revulsion did not stem from pity, but from the violation of steppe honor codes, which dictated that nobles, even enemies, should not be subjected to drawn-out humiliation. And this reaction suggests that Liangji's suffering was part of an emerging tactical practice rather than a universally accepted tradition within the Mongol ranks, explaining why some generals reportedly objected while younger warriors embraced the method with fervor, believing it strengthened their campaign. What gives Han Yishuan's account extraordinary credibility is that physical evidence discovered in 2021 directly mirrors his descriptions, especially regarding the constraints used on high-ranking female captives. Because the excavation team identified a twisted set of iron fastenings fused to Liang Huai's wrist bones, which matched the restraint mechanisms Han referenced in a passage where he writes, "They bind her not for escape, but for posture, for they require her to kneel in a manner that pleases the ritual and satisfies the omen readers who circle the pavilion like vultures, waiting not for flesh, but for the collapse of her spirit." The phrase "collapse of her spirit" reappears later in the journal in a section describing the moment Liangji reportedly refused to recite her ancestral titles. causing one of the guards to strike the ground beside her with the blunt end of a spear while shouting an order. Han struggled to translate something related to breaking the sky thread, a metaphor implying the severing of a dynasty's mandate, which reinforces the notion that her ordeal served a strategic purpose rather than a personal vendetta. But Han's most haunting revelation emerges near the end of the surviving journal pages, when he describes being summoned to the Kirker on a night of heavy snowfall to record an administrative inventory, only to find Liangji lying on the packed snow floor in a state of profound exhaustion. Her breath shallow and her skin discolored from prolonged exposure. And he writes that several officers stood around her debating whether she remained suitable for continued political use because a captive who collapsed entirely could no longer serve as a tool of psychological warfare. And while the senior officer recommended sending her to a separate enclosure for correctional recovery, a term whose meaning historians still debate, Han Kiwan's final entry breaks abruptly. But the last lines remain legible, and they have been quoted in nearly every scholarly publication on Mongol captivity practices since their rediscovery. Because he writes, "If anyone ever finds this, let them know that the cruelty they witness here is not born from barbarity, but from calculation. For the steppe devours kingdoms, not through hunger or rage, but through the slow grinding down of the symbols that hold those kingdoms together. And as she fades, I watch a dynasty fade with her." The ink becomes faint after this line, and the next page is blank, leading many scholars to conclude that he either died shortly afterward or was transferred before he could continue writing. And although no record of his fate exists, the silence of the final pages speaks more loudly than any written sentence could because his absence coincides with the period. Liang Wis remains indicate she endured her final days. Han Qishuan never wrote again. To understand the full magnitude of what Princess Liang Huai endured, one must examine the deliberate machinery the Mongol command constructed around royal captives. Because her suffering was not the product of spontaneous cruelty or a commander's isolated decision, but the outcome of a structured system designed to transform symbolic figures into instruments of domination. And this system relied on a sequence of procedures that unfolded with relentless precision, beginning with identification, where scribes determined a captive's political value, followed by separation, where high-ranking women were removed from ordinary prisoners so their treatment could be orchestrated with maximal psychological effect, and concluding with ritual degradation, a process that, according to modern historian Dr. Praz Leon Shu, functioned as the slow erosion of every public meaning the captive once possessed, allowing Mongol armies to present themselves not merely as conquerors of territories, but as conquerors of entire dynastic identities. The first step in this system involved forcing captives to participate in ceremonial displays intended to break the perceived sanctity of their lineage. And these displays took place in designated areas of the encampment, often near the most heavily trafficked routes, so that merchants, envoys, and soldiers would witness the staged downfall of a political figure whose existence once demanded reverence. And it was in such settings that Liang He, along with several other high-status women, was paraded before onlookers who were instructed to treat the captives as objects stripped of ceremony. And although these scenes did not involve physical assault in the modern sense, the psychological humiliation was profound, as each display served to sever the captive from the respect. The second component involved forced endurance trials in which royal captives were required to stand, kneel, or carry symbolic weights for extended periods, often while reciting their lineage, and failure to maintain posture resulted in deprivation or further ritual tasks. Because Mongol strategists believed that the collapse of a princess's physical poise represented the collapse of the ancestral foundation she embodied. And the steppe tradition of omen reading amplified this logic by treating visible exhaustion as a sign that the enemy's moral authority had reached its limit, thereby justifying intensified military campaigns against the dynastic heartland. These trials were not created for entertainment, but for messaging, as the Mongols used such spectacles to demonstrate that no barrier, cultural, spiritual, or imperial, could withstand their advance. The third element of this system, perhaps the most grueling, involved controlled deprivation where captives were kept alive, but denied warmth, rest, and stability, forcing them into a perpetual state of vulnerability that reinforced their symbolic subjugation. Because Mongol commanders insisted that a royal captive must not be allowed to die quickly, as that would grant her a martyr's death, but must instead be preserved in a liminal state between endurance and collapse, her ongoing suffering functioning as a living testament to the enemy dynasty as inability to protect its most precious members. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation as the conditions of Liang Huai's burial. The kneeling posture, the twisted spine, the fused iron restraints mirror descriptions found in Mongol military records referencing a practice known as kadagai daralahan, or the suppression of the silkborn, a chilling phrase indicating the calculated nature of this ritualized degradation. Let me tell you about another victim whose story reinforces the systemic nature of this process. Her name appears in Yuan administrative annals as Princess Shun, aged 19 at the time of her capture in 1214. Taken during the retreat from the evacuated Jin, secondary capital of Hangzhou. And her fate illuminates the full breadth of Mongol captivity protocols. Shun, unlike Liang, attempted resistance when she realized the Mongols intended to parade her before the encampment. But her resistance only intensified the rituals imposed upon her. Because according to a record preserved in the Togoltu archives, the struggle of a noble-born woman must be unmade through endurance rather than blood, indicating that commanders believed her collapse must be witnessed rather than forced. Shun was subjected to prolonged exposure in the snow-lined pavilion, where officers observed her forced displays and recorded her faltering voice as she attempted to maintain a composed recitation of her ancestry. And the annals note that her eventual collapse was greeted not with triumph, but with silence, because her breakdown represented the symbolic breaking point of her lineage. A moment Mongol divers interpreted as a favorable omen for the continuation of their campaign. The presence of multiple victims undergoing similar treatment demonstrates that the Mongol system operated with a consistency that defies any attempt to portray these acts as isolated or improvised. A Jin envoy named Zhao Yiren left a partial account describing such an event discovered in 1964 within the ruins of an abandoned monastery near Datong, where he writes, "They placed her before us so that we might see not the woman, but the destruction of the palace that raised her. And in her trembling, I saw the trembling of the city we left behind." His testimony affirms that the Mongols used these captives to construct a psychological atmosphere that transcended the battlefield, shaping diplomatic negotiations even before they began. But the system's cruelty did not go unchallenged within the Mongol ranks. Among the more senior commanders, shaped by older steppe traditions that emphasized the preservation of noble dignity even in defeat, discomfort simmered beneath the surface, and one dissenting voice emerges repeatedly in historical sources. General Kuda Beki, who reportedly argued that the prolonged degradation of royal captives violated the honor codes of their ancestors and risked angering the spirits believed to protect the steppe. Yet his objections were dismissed by younger war leaders who insisted that the psychological advantages of these rituals outweighed any spiritual discomfort. A later chronicle suggests that Kudakbeki's protests ultimately led to his reassignment to a peripheral frontier, effectively removing him from the decision-making corps, demonstrating the degree to which dissent was silenced in favor of maintaining the newly established system of symbolic warfare. The fourth institutional element involved the manipulation of time because Mongol commanders understood that prolonged suffering created stronger symbolic resonance than immediate punishment, and they therefore extended the captivity rituals over weeks or months, adjusting the intensity based on battlefield developments. Because each setback in negotiations or supply issues was mirrored by an increase in the demands imposed upon the royal captives whose deteriorating condition acted as a physical barometer for political momentum. It was during one such escalation that Princess Liang Huai's fate became sealed. As Han Qiwan's account indicates, a marked increase in the frequency of her summoned appearances, and her burial posture suggests her body could no longer sustain the repeated transitions from standing to kneeling imposed by the rituals. The fifth and final component of the system centered on erasure. Because once a captive had served her symbolic purpose, Mongol commanders sought to eliminate the possibility that her suffering could be memorialized in a way that strengthened the defeated dynasty's resolve. And they accomplished this by concealing the deaths of these women, burying them in unmarked or deliberately misleading graves, often near the margins of temporary encampments that would soon be abandoned. And this practice explains why Liangji's remains were found beneath a collapsed timber structure rather than in a formal burial site, as her grave was designed to vanish with the retreating army, taking her story with it. The wooden tablet discovered beneath her jaw bearing a harsh command in Old Mongolian script was not intended to be preserved, but to serve as a final message to anyone who might stumble upon her body before the camp, dissolved, reinforcing the idea that her lineage had been broken beyond recovery. When one examines the step-by-step process from identification to ritual degradation, to endurance trials to control, deprivation to eraser, becomes clear why even Genghis Khan's hardened generals reportedly turned away from the sites within the Kirkgur because the brutality they witnessed did not resemble the passion of battle or the swift justice of tribal law, but a methodical dismantling of human dignity conducted with a precision that left no room for mercy, and the tension between traditional honor codes and emerging psychological warfare methods created a fracture within the Mongol military ethos that historians still debate today. Some modern scholars argue that these rituals contributed significantly to the Mongols' reputation for invincibility, as the sight of royal captives reduced to symbols of ruin spread fear through the cities that lay ahead, while others contend that these practices represented a necessary adaptation to the complexities of conquering sedentary empires, with deeply entrenched aristocratic hierarchies. Yet the stories of Princess Liang Huai and Princess Shum endure not through official records, which often downplayed or distorted their experiences, but through the fragmentary writings of witnesses like Han Qiwan and Xiaoyuan, whose words survived only because they were hidden in unlikely places, and through the archaeological evidence unearthed centuries later that confirmed the chilling accuracy of their descriptions, revealing that the suffering of these women was not accidental, but built into the very structure of the Mongol conquest strategy. Their names became footnotes in dynastic histories, overshadowed by the grand narratives of battles and treaties. But their bodies tell a story that the official chroniclers refused to record. A story in which the downfall of a dynasty was etched not only in the ashes of burned palaces, but in the twisted bones of the daughters who once embodied its authority, and in the silence of those who could not speak for themselves, as they were transformed into tools of a war they never chose. When modern historians attempt to quantify the devastation inflicted upon royal captives during the Mongol expansions, they confront the daunting reality that most records were either deliberately erased or never written. Yet by piecing together fragmented annals, battlefield reports, and archaeological discoveries from the Jin and Song frontiers, researchers now estimate that between 130 and 160 high-ranking women, princesses, duchesses, and daughters of ministerial families passed through the Mongol captivity system between 1209 and 1235, a number that may appear small compared to the enormous scale of the empire's conquests, but whose symbolic weight was catastrophic, because each woman represented not merely an individual life, but an entire ancestral lineage. And the systematic dismantling of these figures contributed to psychological shockwaves across northern China, where rumors of their suffering grew into whispered omens that dynastic protection had shattered, leaving the population adrift in fear and resignation. The fate of those who survived initial capture was seldom better than the fate of those who collapsed early, because Surviving often meant enduring prolonged exposure, forced marches in chains, public presentation. Before envoy delegations and the unending strain of rituals designed to drain their strength while keeping them alive. Just long enough to serve the political aims of the encampment. And many who lived through the first weeks succumbed later to illness, starvation, or exhaustion, their bodies weakening under the weight of relentless displacement as the Mongol armies pushed deeper into the plains, carrying their captives like mobile symbols of conquest, whose presence reinforced the terror that preceded the sea. Some women survived long enough to see the collapse of their dynasties, and a few were absorbed into administrative labor units where their identities were concealed to prevent future political exploitation. Yet even these rare survivors lived in a state of profound dislocation, stripped of their former names and purpose, and their later deaths passed without ceremony, making the recovery of their stories nearly impossible for modern scholars. The question of why history buried these events so effectively reveals a second layer of tragedy. While Mongol historians avoided mentioning the captivity process in detail because it conflicted with steppe ideals of noble conduct and threatened to portray their commanders as violators of honor rather than bringers of divine order. And later, Yuan chroniclers writing under the new imperial framework sought to present Mongol rule as harmonious and cosmically sanctioned, which meant that the stories of law over centuries as dynasties rose and fell confusion, scholars inherited these archives and preferring narratives that emphasized moral order and righteous governance quietly suppressed materials that depicted royal women in states of despair or helplessness, creating a historical silence that remained largely American until archaeological findings forced their reappearance. This silence fractured in the early 21st century when several excavation teams working along the former Jin defensive corridor uncovered burial clusters inconsistent with battlefield casualties because the bodies belonged almost exclusively to women, many showing signs of prolonged exposure rather than violent death. And the clothing remnants matched high-status textile weaves rather than military garments, prompting questions about why elite women were dying far from cities and palaces. The most significant discovery occurred in 2021 when the collapsed timber outpost north of the Liao River yielded not only Liangji's remains, but also two additional skeletons found a short distance from her, both positioned in ways suggesting ritual placement and both accompanied by fragments of wooden tablets bearing commands in Old Khloe Mongolian script, one of which read Anen Tasarugai, translated by linguist Dr. to ink, bold as "Let the lineage be severed." The discovery stunned researchers because it provided physical confirmation of a practice that had survived only through ambiguous textual hints, and the emotional weight of seeing the bones of women who had once carried the hopes of dynasties brought an unfiltered immediacy that even the most accurate chronicles could not replicate. What shook the archaeological team even more profoundly was the condition of the tablet placed beneath Liang's jaw. Because the script, though partially eroded, bore a second line not previously recorded in any historical document. A line evidently carved by someone familiar with formal Jin calligraphy rather than steppe script forms, suggesting that another captive or possibly a sympathetic intermediary had added a message in Chinese characters after the Mongol inscriptions were applied. When the team cleaned the wood and enhanced the faded grooves under angled light, they discovered a haunting inscription. Dr. Khan translated it as, "If heaven will not protect us, let our names live in our bones." This single phrase, probably carved in the final days of Liang Huai's confinement, reframed the entire burial site not as a forgotten corner of a vanished encampment, but as a deliberate attempt by the victims themselves to resist total erasure, asserting their existence in the only medium left to them, bone, wood, and silence. The presence of such a message not only intensified the emotional impact of the discovery, but also challenged long-held assumptions about the helplessness of royal captives, suggesting that even within the suffocating confines of the Mongol captivity system, these women retained a sense of identity strong enough to defy obliteration, leaving behind words that, though buried for 8 centuries, survived long enough to confront modern scholars with the reality of their suffering. The inscription forced archaeologists and historians alike to reconsider the narrative of passive victimhood often imposed on royal women in wartime histories, because Liang's final message demonstrated agency in the face of annihilation, a refusal to disappear entirely, even when stripped of every protection her birth had once promised. The excavation leader later admitted that several researchers stepped away from the pit after reading the carved characters not out of professional detachment, but because the emotional magnitude of the inscription momentarily overwhelmed their academic composure, reminding them that beneath every political analysis and tactical reconstruction lies the raw human cost: lives extinguished, identities shattered, and final words left in the dark for centuries. In the end, the bones, the tablets, and the carved message form a narrative that dynastic historians never dared to preserve, revealing that the legacy of these women was not erased after all, but merely hidden beneath layers of soil, snow, and silence, waiting for the day when someone would finally uncover their story and allow their last words to rise once more into the world they were denied. When we return to the silent chamber, where Liang's skeleton lay curled beneath the collapsed beams of a forgotten outpost, with the iron restraints still fused to her wrists and the tablet pressed beneath her jaw like a final witness to her suffering, we realize that the moment the archaeologists gasped in the winter light was not simply the rediscovery of a lost princess, but the unearthing of an entire system of cruelty that dynastic chroniclers worked tirelessly to conceal, because acknowledging what happened to women like her would have required admitting that the fall of kingdoms was not measured solely in sieges and treaties, but in the slow, crushing dismantling of daughters who once embodied the hopes of their courts. And this truth carried a shame neither victors nor survivors wished to preserve. This is what the Mongol Empire tried to hide, not because the acts themselves were anomalous, but because they revealed the machinery of psychological warfare that underpinned their rise. A machinery so methodical and so devastating that even seasoned generals recoiled when confronted with the human consequences of policies designed to break nations from the inside out. When an empire decides that some people are no longer people, but instruments, symbols to be reshaped, degraded, or erased, its victories come coated with shadows that stretch far beyond the battlefield, staining the memories of those who record them and haunting the soil where the forgotten dead lie, waiting for rediscovery. Every skeleton we find, every tablet we uncover, every inscription carved in desperation forces us to acknowledge the voices history denied. And Liang Huai's final message, carved in fragile strokes by a hand trembling between defiance and despair, survives as the last testament of those who refuse to vanish entirely into the silence imposed upon them. If heaven will not protect us, let our names live in our bones. This is the story historians tried to bury, but the truth does not stay buried forever.